Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I come to you with an announcement video about a new reading event called Octember. Now that might ring a bell, perhaps especially if you're an American. Octember, wasn't that a creation of Dr. Seuss? About that time when everyone's wildest wishes come true? Well, this Octember is a bit different. This one is the creation of the lovely James at Quaint and Curious Volumes. He came up with the idea of his own wildest dreams coming true. A whole month of reading books about octopuses. All kinds of books, from serious science to tentacle fiction. A few of us have joined as co-hosts. Pat at Book Chat with Pat, Jenny Jables, Steve Donoghue, and me. I can't wait. In order to participate, you can read anything you like related to octopuses, or even just watch a documentary or other film about these incredible animals. But if you'd like to have some prompts, here are a couple of simple ones. First, read a nonfiction book about cephalopods. And next, read a work of fiction about cephalopods. While you can read anything you'd like about cephalopods this month, let me give you a couple of possibilities if you don't have ideas. First, while I started by mentioning a children's book not about cephalopods, let me mention a children's book that is about cephalopods, The Octopus by Cynthia Rylant, with general illustrations by Preston McDaniels. This book is in the middle of a little series that you and any children in your life might enjoy called The Lighthouse Family. But you don't have to read the others for Rylant's The Octopus to work for you. The setup in the series is that a cat who has committed her life to living in a lighthouse to protect sailors from shipwreck meets a dog whose boat has washed ashore. The two of them become friends while he's at the lighthouse, and they wind up taking in 3 little mice, and they create for themselves a little non-traditional family. In this particular book, the mice are exploring the beach and run across a young octopus who's been stranded in a tide pool. These are very sweet books. Not quite early chapter books, but more than early readers, too. One of the things I especially like about these books, despite what my description probably sounds like, is that they actually treat the setting in a relatively realistic way. For example, the mice are, as we learn, exploring the estuary after a full moon brings in an especially low tide. Incidentally, I see that one of my library's digital collections has both the text and the audio available. If you're interested in more books for children about octopuses, check your local library or whatever your book source is. There is an entire ocean of choices out there. In fact, someone really ought to make a whole video about octopus picture books. Are you the person to embrace that project? Next, I'll mention 2 books that might be the most well-known works of octopus nonfiction intended for adults. Interestingly, both have been a big part of my life. My spouse David and I used to love to read aloud to each other before bed each night. And when we were in Boston, moving our kid into college, we stopped at a local bookstore and picked up both volumes with the intent of reading them back to back. The first is The Soul of an Octopus, a surprising exploration into the wonder of consciousness by Montgomery. And the other is Other Minds, The Octopus, the Sea, and the Deep Origins of Consciousness by Godfrey-Smith. While we knew that the Montgomery's book was a bit more personal than Godfrey-Smith's, we knew that both were considered relatively serious nonfiction. When we got home, David and I started with Montgomery's Soul of an Octopus. After only a chapter or 2, David got very frustrated with what he saw as too much anthropomorphism of the octopuses. I hadn't heard other people make that complaint, including readers who are generally quite sensitive to that kind of issue. But at any rate, he was annoyed by it and decided he didn't want to continue. So we started Peter Godfrey-Smith's Other Minds. And after he read out that first chapter, we said goodnight. And then the next morning, he was still awake, just getting ready to sleep away his Saturday after finishing the book without me. So while I thought I was going to be reading both of them, I did not, and still have not, read either of them. So this might be the perfect time to bite them off. There are audiobook copies of both on my library's digital platform, and I kind of like the idea of listening to them since that was the way I first thought I would be experiencing the books. Another book that a lot of you have read or might choose to read for this reading event is Remarkably Bright Creatures. Old-time viewers here know that I read a lot of books about grief, and this one has been on my list since it was released. Rather than a memoir, it's a novel about a widow who gets a job working the night shift at her local aquarium and makes an unlikely connection with a giant Pacific octopus who lives at the aquarium. In addition to grieving the death of her spouse, she's been trying to deal with the disappearance of her son Eric from a boat on Puget Sound many years before. Let me read you a line from the cover material that makes me a bit skeptical that this is the right book for me. Quote, Everett the detective, Marcellus the octopus deduces what happened the night Tova's son disappeared, and now Marcellus must use every trick his old invertebrate body can muster to unearth the truth for her before it's too late. But perhaps I just need to understand what I'm getting into before I get started. We'll see. Another novel with a not totally dissimilar plot is one released in Australia, I believe, called The Octopus and I by Erin Hortle, about a woman diagnosed with breast cancer who becomes a little obsessed with the local octopus population. The story is not about her diagnosis as much as it is about how she comes to terms with her new body after her double mastectomy surgery. It's her experience of going through this complicated time of reckoning that she befriends the local octopuses. From what I've heard so far, this too is a book that anthropomorphizes local animals, octopuses, but also seabirds, etc. While David was more sensitive to the issue of anthropomorphizing than I am, I don't like it either in general. However, with this particular topic of learning how to embrace a new body, one with scars and a new shape after surgery, is absolutely of interest to me, partly for personal reasons, but also because it's a fairly common experience in this world where 1 in 8 women are diagnosed with breast cancer. And the statistics show that increasingly young women are getting diagnosed and not always making the choice to undergo the increased surgical risks and extra healing time necessary to get reconstruction. I've never seen anything like that addressed in fiction. The last 2 books I've mentioned are using storylines about real octopuses to talk about larger questions in the characters' lives, but sometimes books with octopuses in the title seem to just be using the word in a metaphorical way. And the word octopus can mean all sorts of things. Fairly frequently, it's used to describe the way brain cancer grows, and sometimes used as a metaphor for metastatic cancer in general. But there are lots of other meanings. For example, in the book The Benefits of Being an Octopus by Ann Bradon, what the character means is that if she were an octopus, she could get so much more done in her complicated life than she can with only 2 hands. And she could be more or less invisible too, since she'd be able to camouflage herself so much more easily. Another example of Cephalopodic Metaphor is the book The Life Cycle of the Common Octopus by Emma Knight. I must admit that I don't have a clear understanding about what precisely the title refers to, but it definitely does not involve any real octopuses. I think it might refer to the squeezed from all sides attitude of a young woman trying to make it on her own. At any rate, neither of these 2 novels are going on my list personally. I do want to mention 2 other metaphorical octopuses that interest me much more. One that I've read and one that I haven't yet read but might. The first is Octopus, A Story of California by Frank Norris. This is a classic novel written right at the turn of the 20th century and of course now in the public domain. It's about the coming of the Southern Pacific Railroad in the 1880s. The tracks of the railroad spread out over the state like the tentacles of an octopus, as Norris says, as if to strangle the whole state. Norris chronicles the dispute between the previous way of life, small wheat farmers who'd moved to the frontier west, and the new way of monopolistic corporations that required conformity. That makes it sound like Norris is totally on the side of the wheat farmers, but he's very aware that they exploited the land in somewhat similar ways. I'll be honest, this book does not read like a contemporary novel, and it doesn't have the kind of character-driven resonance all the time that a lot of classic Victorian novels have, for example. But this one has definitely resonated with me in a different way, a more intensely political and historical way for a long time. The other book in this category of the utterly metaphorical is a more contemporary nonfiction work that in some ways addresses the same questions, Taming the Octopus, The Long Battle for the Soul of the Corporation by Kyle Edward Williams. For years, historians have argued that early corporations in the U.S. started to develop during the Progressive Era and during the New Deal and afterwards. In other words, basically from the end of the 19th century through the mid-20th century, and that these were times when the consensus view, more or less, was that corporations should benefit the society at large. Williams, the author, suggests that it's a limited perspective. In fact, he argues that the tools of the New Deal that were supposed to hold corporations responsible were, in fact, exactly the tools that protected shareholders and their profits. It was this unintentional shift that shaped the development of the country into what, he says, is a balder form of capitalism, where the maximization of profit was the undisputed king. I haven't read this book and probably won't this month, but it sounds like a fascinating pair with Norris's Capitalism as Octopus book. I'll recommend 2 more books before we wrap up, both works of poetry. The first is The Octopus Museum, poems by Brenda Shaughnessy. These are gentle poems with a sharp political edge, feminist poems about the intersection of racism and environmental destruction, as well as the loss of health care, high frequency of mass shootings, and increasing fear for a second time that we might be edging toward nuclear war. She imagines a world where the octopuses fight back, where cephalopods take over and rule over humans, keeping us in museum specimen boxes, because they see that we are destroying their home in the world's oceans. One reviewer says something like, this poet puts funny post-apocalyptic vision to work here. Another reviewer says that the poet makes the tragic transcendent. It sounds like an interesting read. The second book of poetry is The Octopus Game by Nicky. Beer's poems are almost always about marine life and primarily octopuses. I haven't gotten to see the book yet, although I have it on hold from interlibrary loan. I gather that she's not writing about octopuses in any metaphoric way, and not in an anthropomorphic way either. I'm excited to see what she's doing. I've heard from a poet friend that her control of sound and imagery in these poems is astonishing, and I can't wait to give them a try. Well, that will do it for today. We would love to have you join us this September to read about cephalopods. Thank you so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.